Guys, let me take about 5 minutes and give you some hints about different pieces of your review. So questions 1, 2, and 3 refer to this picture, and you want to think in 3 dimensions. So notice in the directions it says that the line ST pierces or cuts through the plane at the point T. So in 3 dimensions, this point S is actually above the plane. Then the line cuts through the plane at T, and this dashed part is actually underneath the plane, shooting out below the plane. So you really want to think in 3 dimensions there. Questions 4 and 5 and 6 refer to the number line. I would just count. I think that's the easiest way to do those questions. Questions 7 through 11 all refer to this figure, so you want to think about this in 3 dimensions. This is a 3-dimensional figure where the dashed portions, those dashed segments, are behind the other segments in the figure. And this question is really about the markings. So in particular, you want to think also about words like, what does collinear mean? What does coplanar mean? How do planes intersect? What's needed before you can claim, for instance, that you have a midpoint? So this question is not just about the diagram. This also is about the vocabulary. So going on to the next page, we get questions that are more algebraic in nature, and drawing a picture is really important. So bisecting DGH, what that really means is you can draw the angle DGH, but then after you've drawn it, the ray GI, so starting at G, passing through I, it bisects the angle. So bisecting meaning it cuts that angle into 2 parts that are the same. And now you can label the parts DGI. So DGI, that's this top section here. That's x minus 3. Then IGH, that's this bottom section here. That's 2x minus 13. And then you can write an equation that will relate those 2 parts. You can write an equation that will relate the x minus 3 and the 2x minus 13. And notice the goal is to stop when you found x. That's good enough. So on question number 13, this is about angles being supplementary. So remember that supplementary means the 2 angles add up to 180 degrees. So your first angle's measurement plus your second angle's measurement should add up to make 180 degrees. So writing that equation by using the expressions in the question, that's the key. So, but then notice you're not done when you find the value, in this case of y. Make sure you plug it in order to find the measure of your second angle. So question number 14. You're being asked to find the midpoint of this segment. Now you could graph it if you wanted to, but you don't really need to. These are the endpoints of the segment. So you know both endpoints, you're trying to find the midpoint, and we have a formula for that. So you can simply average the x-coordinates, add the x-coordinates and divide by 2. That's the 8 and the negative 2. You can add the y-coordinates and divide by 2. This is not a question about using the distance formula or finding a length. This is about finding the midpoint, and the midpoint is identified with an x-coordinate and a y-coordinate. That's what you're trying to find. So question number 15 is a good example of a question where you're working backwards. So this right here, this is the midpoint. This is one of the endpoints. The s negative 5 is one of the endpoints. And you're trying to find the other endpoint. You're trying to find m. So this is a question where if you wanted to, you could draw a graph. If this is a question where you could use algebra if you wanted to, although this is a question where I would simply follow the pattern. So and here's how I would organize it. This is just my personal take on it. But m is the midpoint, so the m should be in the middle. I apologize, m is not the midpoint. M is one of the endpoints. So the midpoint, I know, I'll name that, I'll just say midpoint. I know the coordinates of the midpoint. That's 5, negative 11. And I know s's coordinates are 3, 5, So I know S is at 3, 5. I know the midpoint is 5, -1, and I'm trying to find the coordinates of the endpoint. That's what I'm trying to find. So the truth is, you can do this algebraically, you can draw a graph, but I would just follow the pattern. You have to decide, what do you have to do to the 3 in order to get the 5? And if you want the 5 to be the x-coordinate in the middle, then you need to decide, what do you need to do to go from 5 to get to this endpoint's x-coordinate? And same thing for the y-coordinates. You want the -11 to be in the middle. So what does it take to go from 5 to -11? And you need to do then the same thing to get to the y-coordinate of the other endpoint. I like to think about this question in terms of patterns, but there's more than one way to do it. You'll also find on questions 16, 17, 18, and 19, it's all about this diagram. So number 16 says find a pair of vertical angles. There's more than one possible pair. Name a pair of adjacent angles with vertex M. There's only one answer for that one. So name a pair of adjacent angles with vertex S. There are multiple answers there. And then naming a linear pair, there are multiple answers for that one as well. I would advise you to name your angles with 3 points. That's probably the best way to do it. So I think question number 20 is a little bit misleading because it's asking you to find the length of the segment with these endpoints. So if you're finding length, that's a question, that's the same thing as the distance between these two endpoints. You are best off using the distance formula or the Pythagorean theorem to do this. But if you look at the size of the y-coordinates here, one is very large, one has a very small y-coordinate. So the truth is you're going to have a hard time graphing this one and doing this one by using the Pythagorean theorem. I think you're better off using the distance formula here. The length between the two endpoints, that's the same as finding the distance between those endpoints. So I would advise you to use the distance formula. Subtract your x-coordinates, square those, then add that to what you get when you subtract the y-coordinates and square. Subtract your x's and square. Subtract your y's and square. Add those two quantities and take the square root. I'm not too worried about whether you write your answer in simplest radical form or not. You may leave your answer as a radical. You can also evaluate it to be to the nearest tenths place, 1 decimal place if you want, that would be fine. So question number 21, these questions here, 21 to 24, we're back to some algebra style questions, and I think a picture will help. E is the midpoint of DF. So this is not a question about coordinates. This is a question where these expressions represent the lengths of the segments. So the endpoints are D and F, and E is supposed to be the midpoint. So not only is it in the middle, but it's not only in between, rather, D and F, it's in between it just so that D, E, and EF, so that those lengths are the same. That's what it means to put it in the middle. So D to E, that length is 4x minus 1. E to F, that length is 2x plus 7. So this is not a question about finding the coordinates of the midpoint. This is a question about finding a length. So you have to decide how these two lengths relate. And you can write a very simple equation, but don't stop when you solve for x. You need to use that value of x to find the entire length. That's what you're trying to find. So question number 22 is another angle bisector question. So BD bisects the angle ABC. So it's important that you can get that picture set up. Here's A, here's B, here's C. The ray BD is a bisector. So that ray from B to D has to split the angle up into equal parts. So ABD is right here. I'll label it as 7x minus 71. And CBD, that's right down here, I'll label that as 4x minus 26. So this time, again, you can write a relatively simple equation to solve for x, but you're not done until you find the measure of the entire angle, ABC. So you're going to have to substitute your value for x back in order to find this measure and find this measure so that you can add them to get ABC's measure. Number 23 is about the vocabulary word complementary. So we've already seen a question about supplementary. Complementary means that the measures of your two angles, whatever those measures are, those add up to be 90. And once in this case you solve to find x, you're not done because you need to substitute it back in to find the measure of angle B. So question number 24, this question is special because you've got a picture here, and this picture is that of a linear pair. So angle 1 and angle 2, they are adjacent because they share a vertex and a ray, but they're adjacent in a special way because the other two rays form opposite rays. So this is not just an adjacent pair of angles, it's a linear pair because these two rays that they don't share, they actually form a straight line. So you should label angle 1 is x plus 8. Angle 2 is 3x, and then you have to decide how those two angles relate, and this is the key. Those two angles form a linear pair. Because a straight line is measured as a 180-degree angle, I know that those two measures, the 3x and the x plus 8, those have to add up to make 180 degrees. So now, again, once you're finding x, you're not done because the question says to find the measure of angle 2. So you have to find your value for x, and then you can substitute it back in to find the measure of angle 2. So the last page is really just about vocabulary. So the last page starts with a couple of multiple choice questions referring to this diagram to decide if you can identify adjacent angles, linear pairs, supplementary, vertical angles, straight angles, obtuse, acute right angles. It's just practicing the basics of identifying angle pairs. Same thing here. There aren't this many questions, of course, on your test that ask you to do this. We just wanted you to have practice finding the difference between adjacent and vertical, complementary, supplementary angles, linear pairs, and congruent angles. So here I'll do number 28 with you, but the key is here to identify the angles first. So angle RPQ is right here. I'm going to trace it. Here's R, here's P, and here's Q in the middle. So there's one of the angles right there for question number 28. And the other one is QPN, Q to P to N. So here's the other angle right here. So then I have to decide, what do I know about these two angles at the vertex P? So they are definitely adjacent. They share a vertex and a ray. Those are adjacent. So they don't share interiors, though. They are not vertical. Vertical angles have to be made by two straight lines that cross. So they are not complementary. I have no way of determining whether those add up to make 90 or not. They are not supplementary. They certainly don't look supplementary. I don't see them forming opposite rays. They are not a linear pair. And they're not congruent. There's no way to know what those angle measures are. So there's no way to decide if those angles are congruent or not. So in question number 28, the only answer is that they're adjacent. So going forward then for 29, 30, 31, and 32, take some time and make sure you identify, trace, color in the two angles that you're working with before you try to decide which of these vocabulary words apply to them. Hope this has been helpful to get you started and make you feel better about working on your review.